Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today we drift into the thrilling and dangerous world of the Wild West as we explore the life of one of its most infamous figures, Jesse James. From daring robberies to legendary escapes, we'll uncover what it truly meant to be the West's most wanted outlaw. If you enjoy stories from history that bring the past to life, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating journeys into the lives of history's most intriguing figures. Let's saddle up and ride into the story of Jesse James. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that somewhere tacked to the wall of a post office, nailed to a wooden telegraph pole, or pasted to the door of a saloon there is a sheet of paper with your name printed in bold black letters. Beneath it, the word "Wanted." Beneath that, a reward large enough to tempt strangers, bounty hunters, and even men who once called you friend. That was the reality of life for Jesse James, the man who would become the most famous outlaw of the American frontier. To understand what it felt like to be Jesse James at the height of his notoriety, you have to step into the atmosphere of post-Civil War America. The country had survived a brutal conflict that tore families apart, burned cities to the ground, and left scars on nearly every state. In Missouri, where Jesse was born in 1847, the war had not been a distant thunder on the horizon. It had been personal. Neighbor fought neighbor. Farms were raided. Homes were destroyed. Loyalties were tested daily. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred until violence became a language everyone understood. Jesse grew up in this storm. His father, a Baptist minister, died when Jesse was just a boy, leaving the family to survive in a land that was becoming increasingly unstable. His mother remarried, trying to hold together a household in uncertain times. By the early 1860s, when Jesse was still a teenager, Missouri had become one of the most dangerous places in America. It was officially a Union state, but Confederate sympathies ran deep. Guerrilla warfare spread through the countryside like wildfire. For a young man growing up in that environment, violence was not shocking, it was ordinary. Raids happened at night. Armed men appeared without warning. Retaliation followed retaliation. In this world, survival required toughness, loyalty to your side, and a willingness to act without hesitation. Jesse absorbed all of it. When the Civil War broke out, Missouri did not see neat battle lines like Gettysburg or Antietam. Instead, it saw bushwhackers and guerrilla fightersmen who struck quickly and disappeared into forests and farmland. As a teenager, Jesse joined Confederate guerrilla units, fighting alongside men who believed they were defending their homes and their way of life. These fighters operated outside traditional military structure. There were no formal uniforms, no clear battlefields. There were ambushes, sabotage, and swift executions. Imagine being 16 or 17 years old and already living with a gun in your hand. Imagine learning that hesitation could mean death. Jesse James learned these lessons early. The war hardened him. It shaped his instincts. It taught him to trust only those who rode beside him and to treat outsiders with suspicion. When the war ended in 1865, the guns did not fall silent in Jesse's world. For many former guerrillas, peace did not bring opportunity, it brought resentment. The Confederacy had lost. Reconstruction policies were reshaping southern and border states. Federal troops were stationed in areas that had once supported the Confederacy. Banks and railroad symbols of northern industrial power expanded across the landscape. For men like Jesse, the war felt unfinished. The cause they believed in had been defeated, but their anger had not been extinguished. Returning to ordinary farm life was not simple. The habits of violence do not disappear overnight, nor does the distrust of authority formed in years of guerrilla fighting. So what was it like to wake up in those early years after the war as Jesse James? It meant living in a country that felt foreign. It meant seeing Union veterans in positions of power. It meant watching banks and railroads gain wealth and influence while many former Confederate sympathizers struggled economically. In this climate, crime could be rationalized as resistance. Robbery could be framed as rebellion. But beyond politics, there was something else, something personal. Jesse had grown up in chaos. He had come of age in bloodshed, the adrenaline of raids, the intensity of pursuit, the loyalty of armed companions. These experiences bond men together and give them purpose. Peacetime can feel empty after that. As Jesse transitioned from guerrilla fighter to outlaw, he carried with him the mindset of a wartime raider. The targets changed from Union patrols to banks and trains, but the tactics were familiar: move quickly, strike hard, disappear. Every robbery carried echoes of wartime ambush. Now imagine the psychological weight of becoming nationally known. At first, perhaps, Jesse was just one of several former guerrillas involved in robberies. But as the crimes multiplied, newspapers began printing his name. Reports exaggerated his exploits. Some described him as ruthless. Others hinted at a rebellious hero standing up against powerful corporations. In a world without television or internet, newspapers were powerful mythmakers. Stories traveled by telegraph, spreading across states within days. Each retelling grew slightly more dramatic. A robbery might become a daring standoff. A narrow escape might become a legendary chase. And at the center of it all, Jesse James. Being Jesse James meant living inside a story that was growing beyond your control. Picture walking into a town under an assumed name and overhearing strangers talking about the outlaw who robbed a bank in broad daylight, who vanished into thin air, who outsmarted posses and detectives. Imagine hearing half-truths and exaggerations about your own life while sitting quietly in the corner, hat pulled low. There is a strange power in that. Fear can be a weapon. Reputation can clear a path before you even arrive. If townspeople believe you are ruthless, they may hesitate to resist. If lawmen believe you are cunning, they may approach with caution. Legend can be armor, but legend can also be a cage. The more famous Jesse became, the fewer places he could safely appear. The larger the rewards offered for his capture, the more tempting betrayal became. Every handshake carried risk. Every new acquaintance could be an informant. Even loyal companions might calculate the value of turning him in. To live like that requires constant vigilance. Sleep lightly, keep weapons close, trust sparingly. Jesse's face-bearded, intense, often described as calm under pressure, became familiar to readers across America. Illustrations in newspapers depicted him as both villain and romantic outlaw. Some accounts emphasized his Confederate background, appealing to lingering Southern sympathies. Others condemned him as a criminal exploiting post-war instability. In Missouri, opinions were divided. Some communities quietly admired him, seeing in him a continuation of resistance against Northern influence. Others feared the violence that followed his gang's activities. A robbery could leave innocent people dead. A mistaken shot could devastate a family. So what did it feel like internally to carry that dual identity? On one hand, Jesse was a husband and father. He married and tried at times to live under aliases, settling briefly into domestic routines. On the other hand, he was a wanted man with a history that could not be erased. Imagine sitting at a dinner table with your family, knowing that somewhere beyond the walls of your home, men are searching for you with warrants and rifles. Imagine hearing a knock at the door and feeling your pulse quicken, not knowing whether it is a neighbor or a posse. The tension never fully disappears. Being the Wild West's most wanted outlaw meant existing in contradiction. Publicly feared, privately human. Celebrated in some newspapers, hunted relentlessly by others, protected by sympathizers, pursued by detectives. It also meant understanding the power of timing. Jesse's rise coincided with America's fascination with the frontier. The West was expanding. Railroads pushed into new territories. Towns sprang up almost overnight. In such a rapidly changing landscape, figures like Jesse James became symbols of lawlessness, of rebellion, of freedom untamed by institutions. But symbols are simplified versions of reality. The real Jesse James was not a dime novel character riding endlessly across open plains. He was a man shaped by civil war, by regional loyalty, by personal loss, and by a talent for calculated violence. He understood strategy. He knew how to plan escapes. He knew the terrain of Missouri intimately, its forests, rivers, and sympathetic households. Living as Jesse meant mapping the world differently. Instead of seeing towns as destinations, he saw them as risks. Instead of viewing railroads as progress, he saw them as targets. Instead of trusting officials, he anticipated pursuit. And yet there must have been moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when the weight of it pressed heavily. Fame without freedom is a peculiar burden. The very notoriety that protected him through fear also ensured he could never truly relax. The larger the legend grew, the smaller his safe world became. Consider the emotional isolation. Even surrounded by gang members, an outlaw at the top carries unique pressure. Decisions fall on his shoulders. Mistakes are magnified. If a robbery goes wrong, blame travels upward. If a member is captured, secrets could be exposed. To be Jesse James in those early years of rising fame was to stand at the center of a tightening circle of attention, of danger, of myth. And still, there was a certain intoxicating quality to it. The speed of a successful escape, the shock on a banker's face, The thundering hooves as the gang disappeared into open country. The knowledge that law enforcement had once again arrived too late. Adrenaline can be addictive, so can notoriety. But history shows us that no outlaw remains untouchable forever. Every legend builds toward a reckoning. Every wanted poster represents not just fame but countdown. In those early days, though, Jesse James was ascending. His name carried weight. His past as a Confederate guerrilla gave him credibility among sympathizers. His daring robberies captured headlines. His elusiveness frustrated authorities. To live as the Wild West's most wanted outlaw was to wake each day balanced between power and peril. To measure every movement, to speak carefully, to rely on a network of allies while knowing that loyalty could fracture under pressure. It meant accepting that your life would likely be short. Few men in that world died peacefully in old age. Violence breeds violence. The gun that protects you can just as easily invite retaliation. And yet, Jesse James stepped into that role fully. Whether driven by ideology, habit, ambition, or the momentum of events, he embraced the identity forming around him. He became not just a participant in frontier crime but its most recognizable face. So when we ask what it was like to be Jesse James, we are really asking what it feels like to live as both man and myth, to see your own story distorted in print, to be feared by strangers, to inspire loyalty in some and hatred in others. It was a life of motion, of tension, of calculated risk. A life where every sunrise was a question, will this be the day they catch me? And every sunset, if you survived it, was a small victory in a war that never truly ended. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, it did not arrive in Missouri with orderly battle lines and trumpet calls. It arrived in whispers, in accusations, in midnight raids, and in sudden bursts of gunfire that shattered the illusion of peace. For a young man like Jesse James, the war was not something read about in newspapers, it was something that walked up the dirt road to your house. Missouri was officially a Union state, but loyalty was deeply divided. Families split along political lines. Neighbors who had shared harvests and barn raisings now eyed each other with suspicion. Armed militias formed quickly, some loyal to the Union, others fiercely Confederate. The conflict in Missouri became intensely personal, more like a civil feud than a distant national war. In this environment, traditional warfare blurred into something more brutal. Bands of irregular fighters emerged, men who did not wear standard uniforms or march in formation. They struck unexpectedly and disappeared just as quickly. Among the most notorious leaders of these guerrilla bands was William Quantrill. Under his command rode young men hardened by anger and shaped by the chaos around them. Another feared figure was Bloody Bill Anderson, whose reputation for ruthlessness spread terror across the region. Imagine being a teenager in that world. Jesse James was barely out of boyhood when violence began to feel normal. Armed men moved through the countryside. Retaliation followed retaliation. The line between soldier and outlaw dissolved. For many young Missourians with Confederate sympathies, joining guerrilla fighters felt less like criminality and more like defending home and identity. Jess's older brother Frank had already aligned himself with Confederate forces. Family loyalty mattered. So did regional pride. When Jesse joined guerrilla fighters, he entered a world governed by speed, secrecy, and absolute commitment to your side. There were no official camps with bugle calls at dawn. There were hidden camps in wooded ravines, whispered plans by firelight, and constant readiness to mount a horse at a moment's notice. Guerrilla warfare demanded a particular mindset. It required patience during long hours of hiding, followed by explosive action when the moment came. It required familiarity with terrain, knowing which creek beds allowed silent approach, which wooded hills provided cover, which farmhouses offered shelter. It required trust in the men riding beside you, because betrayal or hesitation could mean death. For Jesse James, this was an education far different from any classroom. He learned how to move unseen. He learned how to fire accurately under pressure. He learned how to retreat swiftly when outnumbered. He learned that fear could be both enemy and ally. If you controlled your own fear, you could exploit it in others. But guerrilla warfare also cultivated something darker. It blurred moral boundaries. Executions could be swift. Revenge killings were common. Stories from Missouri during this period include brutal acts on both sides, Union and Confederate alike. Homes were burned. Prisoners were shot. Civilians suffered. Living inside that environment reshapes a person. When violence becomes routine, it alters perception. The shock that might paralyze someone unfamiliar with conflict fades. Decisions become quicker, sometimes colder. For Jesse, adolescence was not marked by school dances or apprenticeships, it was marked by raids and survival. Under leaders like Quantrill and Anderson, guerrilla bands conducted ambushes on Union patrols, attacked supply lines, and targeted individuals suspected of Union loyalty. These operations required coordination and nerve. Riders would approach quietly, strike with overwhelming force, and withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. Picture the tension before an ambush. The stillness of trees, the weight of a rifle in your hands, the pounding of your heart in your ears. Then suddenly gunfire erupts. Smoke fills the air. Horses rear. Within minutes, it is over. Either you ride away victorious or you do not ride away at all. That rhythm, anticipation, explosion, escape became familiar to Jesse James. The Civil War officially ended in 1865, but for many guerrilla fighters, the habits of war did not vanish with surrender papers. The Confederacy was defeated. Federal authority expanded. Reconstruction policies aimed to rebuild and reorganize southern and border states. But resentment lingered deeply in places like Missouri. For young men who had lived by the code of guerrilla warfare, peacetime felt disorienting. The structure of daily raids and shared danger disappeared. Economic prospects were uncertain. Communities were still divided. Federal troops and officials represented a victorious power that many former Confederates distrusted. Imagine being 18 years old, already accustomed to carrying weapons and operating outside formal authority, suddenly told to return to quiet farm life under a government you resent. The adrenaline fades, but the instincts remain. The distrust remains. The sense of unfinished struggle remains. For Jesse James, the transition from wartime guerrilla to peacetime outlaw was not a dramatic leap, it was a gradual shift. The skills he had acquired did not disappear, they adapted. The targets changed from Union patrols to banks and railroads. The justification shifted from wartime loyalty to post-war resistance. But the method, swift strikes, coordinated movement, reliance on trusted comrades, they were rooted in guerrilla experience. To understand what it felt like to be Jesse during this phase, you must grasp that he did not see himself simply as a criminal emerging from nowhere. In his mind and in the minds of sympathizers was continuing a fight that had merely changed shape. Banks and railroads were often associated with northern economic power. Robbing them could be framed as striking back. Of course, robbery is robbery. Innocent people could be harmed. Money taken did not necessarily redistribute to the poor. But in the turbulent atmosphere of post-war Missouri, narratives mattered. Former Confederate supporters were eager for symbols of defiance. A former guerrilla turning his weapons against institutions they resented could become that symbol. Yet beneath any political framing was the undeniable reality of personal transformation. Years of irregular warfare had shaped Jesse's reflexes and worldview. He had learned to rely on a small, tight-knit group. He had learned that conventional authorities were enemies. He had learned that boldness often compensated for numbers. Guerrilla leaders like Quantrill and Anderson operated on charisma and reputation. Their men followed them because they projected confidence and decisiveness. Jesse absorbed those lessons too. Leadership in such circles depended on daring. Hesitation invited challenge. Success built loyalty. Anderson, in particular, had cultivated a fearsome image. Stories of his brutality spread widely. Fear itself became a weapon. Communities hesitated to resist if they believed resistance meant certain death. Jesse witnessed how reputation could magnify power. As the war concluded and he stepped into outlaw life, Jesse understood that newspapers and rumor could amplify his name just as fear had amplified Anderson's. He learned that a well-timed robbery reported dramatically could build mystique. Mystique discouraged resistance. Resistance discouraged capture. But let's step back into the war years for a moment. Consider the psychological cost of constant vigilance. Guerrilla fighters never fully relaxed. Even at camp they posted lookouts. Surprise attacks were common. Union forces hunted them relentlessly. Capture could mean imprisonment or execution. Sleep came lightly. Weapons were kept within reach. Living like that wires the brain for survival mode. The world becomes a map of threats and escape routes. Trust narrows to a small circle. Outsiders are potential enemies. For Jesse James, adolescence was spent in that heightened state. It is no surprise that after the war he struggled to adopt a different rhythm. Peace requires patience. Farming requires predictability. Lawful life requires acceptance of authority. Those habits clash with guerrilla instincts. Another element shaped Jesse during the war: loyalty. Guerrilla bands often functioned like extended families. Shared danger forged intense bonds. Betrayal was punished severely. Loyalty was rewarded with protection and status. Jess's identity became intertwined with his comrades. When the war ended, many former guerrillas found it difficult to integrate back into communities that had been divided. Some were viewed as heroes by Confederate sympathizers. Others were viewed as criminals by Union loyalists. The social landscape was fractured. Imagine walking through a town where half the population might secretly admire you and the other half might report you. That tension did not disappear with the war's end. It lingered, shaping how Jesse navigated society. The brutality of guerrilla warfare also desensitized participants to violence. When death becomes familiar, the threshold for action lowers. Shooting at an armed patrol during war may feel justified. Shooting at a bank guard during a robbery may feel like a continuation of survival tactics. This does not excuse the violence, but it helps explain the psychological bridge between wartime combat and peacetime crime. During the war, Jesse reportedly suffered injuries, including a severe chest wound. Physical trauma can deepen psychological resolve. Surviving near death reinforces a sense of invincibility or destiny. For some, it creates caution. For others, it fuels boldness. Surviving danger repeatedly can build the belief that you are meant to endure. As stories of guerrilla exploits circulated, names like Quantrill and Anderson became infamous. Their actions were condemned in northern newspapers and sometimes romanticized in southern-leaning accounts. Jesse observed how narrative shaped memory. He saw how men could become legend. Controversial once through print. When he later transitioned into outlaw activities, he would benefit from allies in the press who cast him in a favorable light. But that foundation was laid during the war, when narrative battles paralleled physical ones. Now picture the moment the war officially ends. Surrender documents are signed far away. Leaders concede defeat. But on the Missouri frontier, distrust does not evaporate overnight. Guerrilla fighters must decide: surrender, flee, or adapt. For Jesse James, adaptation meant channeling wartime skills into new ventures. The structure of guerrilla bands provided a template for what would later become organized outlaw gangs. Quick strikes, shared spoils, reliance on mobility, use of rural hideouts. The Civil War had trained him not only in violence but in logistics. Horses had to be maintained, routes planned, safe houses identified, informants monitored. These were transferable skills. But there was also a psychological thread connecting war to outlaw life: identity. During the war, Jesse was a Confederate guerrilla. That identity provided purpose. After the war, being an outlaw offered continuity, a new role built on old foundations. To be Jesse James in those years was to live in the shadow of defeat but fueled by defiance. It was to see federal authority not as neutral law but as the continuation of a force that had crushed your side. It was to interpret economic expansion railroads, banks as symbols of that same authority. Whether that interpretation was fair or flawed is debated by historians. What matters for understanding Jesse's mindset is that he perceived himself within that framework. The war also taught him something about spectacle. Guerrilla raids were not quiet affairs. They were meant to send messages. Boldness amplified fear. Daring attacks spread through rumor networks. That lesson carried forward. Robberies committed boldly in daylight attracted attention. On detention built legend. As his post-war activities began, Jesse James was not a random criminal emerging from obscurity. He was a product of Missouri's civil conflict, shaped by leaders who operated outside conventional warfare, hardened by personal experience, and accustomed to a life where survival depended on nerve. Being molded by guerrilla warfare meant accepting unpredictability as normal. It meant expecting pursuit. It meant trusting only a chosen few. It meant equating authority with threat. So when we say war made him dangerous, we mean more than physical skill. We mean mental conditioning, emotional calluses, a worldview forged in conflict. Imagine again that young man barely out of adolescence who has seen friends killed, who has ambushed enemies, who has ridden through smoke and chaos. Peace asks him to slow down, to submit to laws he distrusts, to farm quietly in a land still simmering with resentment. Some men could make that transition. Jesse James did not. Instead, he carried the war forward inside himself. And in doing so, he transformed from guerrilla fighter into something that would capture the imagination of an entire nation, an outlaw whose methods were born in civil war, whose instincts were sharpened in ambush, and whose legend would grow from the ashes of a divided country. When the smoke of the Civil War cleared, the landscape of Missouri did not suddenly become peaceful or prosperous. Farms were damaged, communities were divided, trust was fragile. For men like Jesse James and his older brother Frank, the war had not only shaped their skill set, had shaped their sense of identity. They were no longer boys from a rural farm. They were former guerrilla fighters with reputations, connections, and a familiarity with violence that did not easily fade. Out of that environment emerged what would later be known as the James Younger Gang. It was not a corporation, not an army, not even a formally structured organization. It was a loose but disciplined association of former Confederate guerrillas and trusted allies who understood one another through shared wartime experience. Among them were the younger brothers Cole, Jim, John, and Bob, men who, like Jesse and Frank, had ridden in the chaos of Missouri's irregular warfare. To understand what it felt like to be Jesse James during the rise of the gang, you have to imagine the mixture of calculation and adrenaline that defined those early robberies. These were not spontaneous acts. They required planning, intelligence, timing. Horses had to be strong and fast. Escape routes needed to be mapped carefully. Safe houses identified in advance. Every participant had a role. One of the earliest major robberies attributed to the James brothers took place in Liberty, Missouri in 1866. It is often described as one of the first peacetime daylight bank robberies in American history. The symbolism mattered. This was not a midnight theft. It was bold, public, almost theatrical. Men rode into town in broad daylight, entered a bank, and left with cash while stunned citizens watched events unfold. Picture the scene from Jess's perspective. You approach a town that appears ordinary: wooden storefronts, a few wagons, townspeople moving about their daily routines. You ride in calmly, trying not to draw suspicion. You dismount. Your boots hit the dirt street. You step into a bank that smells of paper, ink, and polished wood. For a brief moment, everything feels normal. Then the tension snaps. Guns are drawn. Commands are shouted. Bank employees freeze. Seconds stretch into eternity. Outside, townspeople begin to sense something is wrong. Within minutes, the robbery is complete. The gang rushes out, mounts their horses, and gallops away in a cloud of dust. Your heart pounds. The wind tears at your clothes as you ride hard toward open country. Behind you, shouts rise. Perhaps a shot is fired in pursuit. But you know the terrain. You know which road forks into woods. You know where fresh horses may be waiting. That was the rhythm of Jesse James' new life approach: strike, vanish. What distinguished the James Younger gang was not merely their willingness to rob, it was their coordination and discipline. They had learned during the war how to operate as a unit. In a bank robbery, one man controlled the door, another guarded employees, another gathered money, someone watched the street. Efficiency reduced risk. Speed reduced the chance of organized resistance. For Jesse, these robberies were not random bursts of crime. They were operations. Each successful escape reinforced confidence. Each headline that followed built notoriety, and notoriety was power. In post-war America, newspapers were hungry for stories that captured readers' attention. Frontier crime was sensational. Reports of daring robberies traveled quickly by telegraph, appearing in cities far beyond Missouri. The name Jesse James began appearing in print with increasing frequency. Imagine discovering that people hundreds of miles away are reading about you, that your actions in a small-town bank are being discussed in distant cities. Fami's specially infamous fame can be intoxicating. It creates a sense of scale. You are no longer just a man on horseback, you are a figure in a national narrative. But fame also changes the stakes. With each successful robbery, rewards increased. Law enforcement pressure intensified. Railroads and banks were not powerless institutions. They had resources, influence, and political connections. They demanded action. Yet in those early years, the gang thrived on mobility. Missouri's rural landscape offered cover-rolling hills, wooded areas, sympathetic farms. The war had created networks of Confederate-leaning households willing to provide food, shelter, or information. Silence could be a form of support. For Jesse, the countryside was not empty space. It was a map of alliances and escape routes. He knew which families might offer refuge. He knew which towns were less friendly. That knowledge gave him confidence. Another shift during this period was the gang's expansion into train robberies. Trains were the arteries of a growing nation, carrying money, goods, and passengers across vast distances. Stopping a train required coordination and daring. The gang might sabotage tracks or force engineers to halt. Then, in moments of chaos, they would board and seize cash shipments. Imagine the audacity required. A moving train represents industrial power and modern progress. To halt it on open track and rob it was to challenge that power publicly. It was spectacle layered upon spectacle. For Jesse James, train robberies combined the skills of guerrilla warfare with the symbolism of resistance. Fast movement, surprise, coordinated roll-call were familiar. But now the stage was larger. A train robbery made headlines far beyond Missouri. As the gang's reputation grew, so did internal dynamics. Leadership mattered. While Frank James was older and perhaps more cautious, Jess's boldness and charisma often placed him at the forefront. Leadership in such a group depended on trust. If members believed a plan was reckless, loyalty could fracture. If a robbery failed due to poor judgment, consequences could be fatal. So being Jesse James meant carrying responsibility for decisions that affected the lives of every man riding beside him. That pressure does not disappear simply because the lifestyle is criminal. If anything, it intensifies. There are no formal courts to resolve disputes, no insurance policies. Mistakes are paid for in blood or imprisonment. The gang's operations also required intelligence gathering. They needed information about when banks held large deposits, when trains carried significant cash shipments, which towns had minimal armed resistance. Informants sometimes willingly, sometimes unknowingly played roles. Imagine spending days quietly observing a target town, watching patterns, counting guards, timing movements, planning not only entry but exit. Every detail mattered. Then came execution. A robbery might last only minutes, but it was preceded by days of preparation. That combination of patience and explosive action mirrored Jess's wartime experiences. As months turned into years, Jesse James transformed from a former guerrilla into a symbol of frontier lawlessness. Yet the reality behind the symbol was complex. Some robberies resulted in violence and death. Innocent people could be caught in crossfire. Bank tellers, bystanders, or passengers might suffer. Each death deepened the divide between those who romanticized Jesse and those who despised him. From Jess's perspective, maintaining composure during robberies was essential. Panic spreads quickly. If one gang member hesitated, chaos could erupt. So calmness became a performance. A steady voice issuing commands. A controlled demeanor suggesting confidence. Fear management is a skill. Jesse had learned it during the war. Now he applied it in banks and on trains. Yet even as the gang prospered in notoriety, risks multiplied. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating efforts. Rewards increased. Wanted posters spread. Being recognized became a growing danger. Imagine entering a town and sensing eyes linger too long. Imagine overhearing whispers that your face matches a description in a poster. The larger your legend, the smaller your anonymity. Despite that, the gang continued operations through the late 1860s and early 1870s. Success can breed overconfidence. Each clean escape reinforces belief in invincibility. By 1876, the long run of success enjoyed by Jesse James and the James Younger gang was beginning to strain under its own weight. For nearly a decade, they had robbed banks and trains across multiple states, slipping through the fingers of local law enforcement and frustrating private detectives. Their name carried power. Their legend seemed untouchable. But no legend exists outside reality forever. The plan to rob the bank in Northfield, Minnesota, in September 1876 was bold, perhaps too bold. Northfield was not a random target. It was far from the gang's Missouri base of support. It was in Union territory, a state with strong anti-Confederate sentiment. Some historians believe the choice of target had symbolic overtones, as the bank had connections to prominent Union political figures. Imagine the mindset going into that robbery. The gang rides north, far beyond familiar safe houses and sympathetic farms. The terrain is less known. The communities less likely to offer quiet refuge. Every mile north increases risk. Every unfamiliar town narrows the margin for error. Yet confidence can override caution. Years of successful robberies had built a belief in their own efficiency. They had outpaced posses before. They had survived Pinkerton pursuit. Why not one more daring strike? On September 7, 1876, members of the gang entered Northfield. Some remained outside guarding horses. Others went into the First National Bank. Inside, they demanded access to the safe. But something went wrong. The bank's acting cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood, refused to open the safe, insisting it was on a time lock. Whether that was entirely true or partially stalling, his resistance disrupted the gang's expected rhythm. Outside, townspeople noticed tension. Armed citizens began organizing. Northfield did not freeze in fear. It fought back. Shots rang out in the street. Local men retrieved rifles from hardware stores and homes. They fired from windows and alleyways. The element of surpriseth gang's greatest weapon evaporated in minutes. Imagine being Jesse James in that instant. You are accustomed to compliance, to shock and speed. Suddenly bullets are coming from multiple directions. Civilians are shooting back with determination. Horses panic. Smoke fills the air. Confusion replaces control. The robbery collapsed into chaos. 2 gang members were killed in the streets. Several were wounded. The carefully choreographed operation became a desperate escape. Jesse and his brother Frank managed to flee, but the younger brothers Cole, Jim, and Bob were severely injured and later captured. Their arrests marked the end of the original gang's core structure. The Northfield raid shattered more than bodies, it shattered invincibility. For years, the James Younger gang had operated under the aura of unstoppable momentum. Northfield exposed vulnerability. It demonstrated that organized resistance could defeat them. Imagine riding away from Northfield, knowing that trusted companions lie dead or captured behind you, knowing that the newspapers will not describe a daring success, but a failed massacre, knowing that the hunt will intensify beyond anything experienced before. The escape itself was grueling. Jesse and Frank fled through the Minnesota countryside, pursued relentlessly. They navigated swamps, fields, and forests. At times separated, at times together, they relied on endurance and familiarity with evasion tactics learned during the war. But this was not Missouri. They were far from sympathetic networks. Every farmhouse could be hostile, every town alerted by telegraph. The younger brothers' capture amplified the stakes. Injured and unable to escape, they were arrested and later sentenced to life in prison. The public trial provided a dramatic spectacle. Newspapers detailed their wounds, their statements, their fate. Imagine reading accounts of your former comrades in chains, men you rode beside for years, men who shared danger and profit, now imprisoned indefinitely. The psychological weight must have been immense. For Jesse James, Northfield marked a turning point from expansion to contraction. The gang as it once existed was gone. The core brotherhood forged in war and refined in robberies had fractured permanently. Returning to Missouri, Jesse attempted to rebuild. But rebuilding after such a public disaster is not simple. Reputation cuts both ways. Fear remains, but so does awareness of vulnerability. Law enforcement is emboldened by success. Rewards increase. Informants become more tempted. Jesse recruited new membersmen younger, less seasoned, without the shared wartime history that bound the original group. This altered the internal dynamic profoundly. Imagine leading a team where trust is thinner, where you cannot rely on years of shared experience, where loyalty may be more transactional than familial. The earlier gang members had ridden together through guerrilla warfare. They understood unspoken signals. They trusted each other instinctively. The new recruits lacked that foundation. Being Jesse James during this period meant carrying not just external pressure but internal uncertainty. He continued robberies, though on a smaller scale. The operations lacked the sweeping coordination of earlier years. Each job carried heightened risk because the safety net had shrunk. Meanwhile, public perception evolved. Northfield had damaged the myth of invincibility. The story was no longer solely about daring escapes, it included failure and civilian resistance. And yet, some admirers remained. In certain southern-leaning circles, Jesse was still viewed as a defiant figure. But the broader national mood increasingly favored order and modernization. Railroads expanded further. Law enforcement improved coordination. The space for romantic outlawry narrowed. Imagine living in a world that is modernizing against you. Telegraph wires hum overhead. Photographs circulate more widely. Descriptions become more accurate. The frontier myth persists in fiction, but in reality, institutions grow stronger. Jess's personal life during these years reflected tension. He used aliases, attempting to settle quietly with his wife and children. He moved between homes, cautious and alert. Domestic routines coexisted with clandestine planning. Picture the dual existence: reading bedtime stories to your children, then later discussing escape routes and train schedules with new associates. Hiding weapons within reach. Listening for unusual noises at night. Paranoia deepens after betrayal and capture. The younger brother's imprisonment served as a warning. Capture meant not quick execution but decades in prison. The thought of confinement off losing mobiletta must have haunted Jesse. A man accustomed to horseback freedom would likely find imprisonment unbearable. So caution intensified. But caution conflicts with outlaw success. Robbery requires boldness. Too much hesitation leads to failure. Balancing the two is nearly impossible. New gang members included men like Robert Ford and his brother Charlie. Unlike the Youngers, they had not shared the war. They admired Jesse's legend, perhaps even idolized him. But admiration is not the same as loyalty forged in shared bloodshed. Imagine leading men who see you as a celebrity as much as a commander. They may crave glory. They may seek personal gain. Their motivations may not align perfectly with yours. As the 1870s drew to a close, Jesse James was no longer riding at the height of mythic ascent. He was navigating decline masked by continued defiance. Each robbery attracted swift pursuit. Each associate represented potential betrayal. Financial rewards for his capture remained substantial. Governors publicly vowed to bring him to justice. The circle tightened. Psychologically, the loss of the original gang likely created isolation. Frank remained, but the broader brotherhood was gone. Shared memories of wartime and early robberies became ghosts. Imagine sitting quietly, recalling Northfield gunfire, the fallen comrades, the wounded Youngers surrendering. Such memories linger. Still, Jesse pressed forward. Part of that persistence may have been pride. To retire quietly would feel like surrender. To stop would concede that Northfield marked defeat. Outlaw identity becomes self-reinforcing. When society labels you irredeemable, pathways back narrow. Trust from institutions is absent. Employment opportunities scarce. The longer one lives outside the law, the fewer options remain inside it. Thus, Jesse James continued operating, but with increasing caution and decreasing cohesion. Law enforcement strategies adapted. Rather than large, visible posses, authorities relied more on informants and surveillance. The focus shifted from dramatic chases to quiet infiltration. This shift is critical. The earlier phase of Jesse's career thrived on open confrontation and escape. The later phase became vulnerable to subtle betrayal. Imagine sensing that danger no longer gallops toward you on horseback but waits quietly in the same room. The new gang's robberies were fewer and less spectacular. The weight of Northfield lingered in public memory. Citizens felt empowered by the knowledge that resistance could work. Jesse's once expansive world contracted into cautious routines. Safe houses were limited. Travel required greater disguise. Meetings occurred discreetly. Yet even under pressure he maintained composure. He projected confidence. Admitting fear could fracture fragile loyalty. Internally, however, tension must have mounted. Every new recruit required evaluation. Every whisper of rumor demanded attention. The possibility of betrayal was no longer abstract. Being Jesse James in this stage meant living between past glory and impending reckoning. The fall of the original gang marked the beginning of an inevitable trajectory. The Northfield raid did not end his life, but it ended the era of collective invincibility. From that point forward, survival depended less on speed and more on secrecy, less on daring and more on trust. And trust in that world was the rarest currency of all. The Wild West image often celebrates gunfights and horseback chases, but the quieter reality of decline is more psychological. It is the weight of watching your circle shrink, the strain of knowing that every alliance may carry hidden motives. As the years after Northfield passed, Jesse James stood increasingly alone, accompanied by a few associates, shielded by a fading myth, and pursued by institutions growing more methodical. The fall of the gang was not a single moment. It was a process that began with gunfire in a Minnesota street, a process that replaced confidence with caution, a process that turned a brotherhood into fragments, and a process that set the stage for the final irreversible betrayal that would soon follow. Because once the foundation cracks, the collapse is only a matter of time. The final chapter of Jesse James's life was marked by a mix of inevitability, careful calculation, and the ever-present tension between myth and mortality. By the early 1880s, the man who had once led a gang of daring outlaws across multiple states was no longer operating with the freedom and impunity he had once known. Law enforcement, private detectives, and even public sentiment were converging in ways that made survival increasingly precarious. Every step forward carried the weight of years spent living outside the law, every decision measured against the possibility of capture or death. Jesse's survival depended heavily on the networks he had maintained over decades, alliances formed during the Civil War and the post-war period of outlaw activity. Those networks allowed him to remain in Missouri, to move among sympathizers, and to continue to orchestrate smaller-scale robberies while avoiding the full force of law enforcement. He was living in a world in which secrecy had become as critical as skill with a firearm or the ability to ride swiftly through the countryside. Daily routines involved extreme caution. Entrances were carefully watched, letters scrutinized for informants, and any stranger approaching a home regarded with suspicion. Every movement required a balance between public appearances and clandestine survival. As the years wore on, however, Jess's circumstances reflected the inevitable tension between notoriety and vulnerability. His exploits had been widely reported, and while some newspapers romanticized him as a folk hero, others depicted him as a dangerous criminal whose capture would restore a sense of law and order to the frontier. This duality placed Jesse in an unenviable position. He needed the myth to maintain his status and influence, yet that same myth drew attention and increased the danger he faced. The more famous he became, the fewer places existed where he could safely hide. Within this environment, the dynamics of trust were critical. The James brothers' earlier successes had depended on a tight-knit circle of loyal, experienced comrades. By the 1880s, the original gang had dissolved. Key members had been captured, killed, or imprisoned, leaving Jesse reliant on newer associates, some of whom had not been tested in the crucible of guerrilla warfare or earlier robberies. This generational and experiential gap introduced new risks. Loyalty was less assured, ambition or fear could drive individuals to betrayal. Every decision Jesse made, whether it was where to hide, who to trust with information, or when and where to conduct a robbery, carried the possibility of catastrophic consequence. The web of human relationships that once reinforced his security now contained hidden threats. Among these threats, one individual would prove decisive: Robert Ford. Unlike the Youngers or other original gang members, Ford had not grown up alongside Jesse or participated in the earlier guerrilla exploits that had forged a bond of loyalty and shared history. Ford admired Jesse, perhaps to the point of hero worship, but he also recognized the opportunity to gain fame, money, and favor by betraying the man whose name had overshadowed his own. Jesse, accustomed to command and accustomed to projecting authority, may have underestimated the subtlety and duplicity that could emerge from within a newer, less bonded circle. Living under constant threat of law enforcement and betrayal created a unique psychological pressure. Every visitor could be an informant. Every sudden knock or unusual presence could indicate an impending attack. Sleep was never entirely restful. Weapons had to remain within easy reach. Trust had to be rationed carefully, extended only where the potential reward outweighed risk. This environment cultivated a form of hypervigilance, a constant awareness of the potential for sudden violence. For a man who had spent decades in motion, the mental burden of isolation and suspicion was as heavy as the physical demands of escape. Despite these pressures, Jesse continued to maintain the outward appearance of confidence and control. Part of the power of his legend lay in his ability to project fearlessness, to ride with assurance, and to conduct operations with a calculated boldness that had characterized his entire career. Public perception mattered. Jesse understood that stories of his daring deeds, whether true, exaggerated, or romanticized, provided a form of protective mythos. If the public viewed him as untouchable, that perception could shape behavior in subtle ways, dissuading some from attempting confrontation and influencing sympathizers to remain silent or supportive. Yet no amount of narrative protection could prevent betrayal from within. By the early 1880s, the pressures of age, notoriety, and limited safe options converged. Jesse had lived more years in constant danger than most men experience in a lifetime. Each day outside the law reinforced both skill and vulnerability. He had mastered the art of rapid response, evasion, and coordination, yet the cumulative stress of prolonged life on the run could not be escaped. Survival required not only physical skill but keen judgment and the ability to anticipate the motives of allies and enemies alike. Every decision had consequences that were increasingly irreversible. It was in this context that the final betrayal occurred. Robert Ford, motivated by ambition, money, or perhaps a desire to end the life of the figure whose myth had eclipsed his own, struck decisively. On April 3, 1882, Jesse James was in his home in St. Joseph, Missouri, a town where he had long been relatively secure. The house represented both domestic normalcy and the fragile concealment that sustained him. Inside, Jesse likely felt a sense of routine and familiarity, possibly even such a false sense born of years of calculated survival. The intrusion, however, was sudden and fatal. Ford's actions were swift and unexpected. Jesse was shot in the back of the head as he stood on a chair to straighten a picture frame, a gesture symbolically ordinary, domestically mundane, yet tragically revealing of the human vulnerability that even legends cannot escape. The act was both literal and symbolic. The outlaw who had eluded capture, who had survived gunfights, ambushes, and pursuit for decades, was undone not by confrontation but by betrayal from within his trusted circle. The immediate consequences of the killing were profound. Ford and his accomplices were arrested, but they quickly negotiated leniency, largely because they had eliminated the most wanted outlaw in the nation. The law celebrated the resolution of a long-running threat. Yet public reaction was deeply divided. Some hailed Ford as a hero, a man who had restored order. Others condemned the act as cowardly, emphasizing that killing a man from behind violated even the rough moral code of the West. Newspapers across the country debated the ethics and significance of the killing, feeding the myth that Jesse James had become immortalized in death as he had been feared in life. The death of Jesse James solidified his legend in ways that continued to reverberate culturally and historically. He became a symbol of the outlaw archetype, a man who challenged authority, operated at the edges of law and society, and ultimately met a violent end. Songs, stories, and dime novels immortalized his exploits, embellishing both daring successes and failures, creating a narrative that blurred fact and fiction. Folk memory reframed his life as a tale of defiance, cunning, and personal code, often ignoring the moral ambiguities inherent in his criminal actions. From a psychological perspective, the trajectory of Jess's life offers insight into the interplay between skill, circumstance, and perception. His years of guerrilla warfare during the Civil War had honed his abilities, his strategic thinking, and his comfort with violence. These same experiences laid the groundwork for the outlaw career that followed. Yet the same training in survival, coordination, and rapid decision-making could not compensate for structural shifts. The dissolution of trusted networks, the expansion of organized law enforcement, the evolution of surveillance technologies, and the inherent unpredictability of human motives. Ultimately, it was a combination of personal vulnerability and social change that determined his fate. Jess's death also illustrates the complex relationship between myth and reality. While historians can trace his movements, quantify his robberies, and examine the context of his life, public imagination elevates his story into legend. The dichotomy between the real Jessian individual navigating a dangerous, morally complex world and the symbolic Jesseth fearless, almost mythic outlaw is central to understanding both his historical significance and his cultural resonance. He represents the tension between individual agency and systemic forces, between skill and chance, between loyalty and betrayal. In death, Jess's story continued to influence perceptions of the American West. His life and demise became emblematic of the period's turbulence, a society grappling with the aftermath of civil war, the expansion of industrial infrastructure, and the challenges of law enforcement in a rapidly changing landscape. The narrative of Jesse James reflects broader themes: the persistence of memory, the shaping of legend, and the interplay between moral ambiguity and public fascination. His actions, both celebrated and condemned, are inseparable from the social, economic, and political currents of post-Civil War America. The killing by Robert Ford also serves as a cautionary illustration of the fragility inherent in any life dependent on secrecy, trust, and personal networks. No matter how skilled or daring, an individual operating in isolation or on the margins of society faces existential risk, not only from external threats, but from betrayal and the unpredictability of human motives. Jess's decades of survival demonstrate mastery of external threats, but reveal that internal dynamics, loyalty, ambition, fear can be equally determinative. Culturally, Jesse James has become more than an individual historical figure. He functions as a lens through which Americans have examined notions of heroism, rebellion, and the moral complexity of frontier life. In literature, cinema, and folklore, he embodies the archetype of the outlaw, a figure simultaneously feared, admired, and mythologized. The enduring fascination with his life and death reflects broader societal themes, including the negotiation of law and order, the allure of rebellion, and the ways in which public narrative shapes memory. In analyzing the arc of Jesse James' life, a recurring pattern emerges: skill and experience, honed in extreme circumstances, allow for extraordinary achievement. Yet skill alone cannot shield one from structural shifts, technological advancements, or personal betrayal. Human agency is always constrained by circumstance, and legend, while protective in some social contexts, cannot alter the realities of mortality. Jess's final days exemplify the convergence of multiple forces. The expansion of railroads, the professionalization of law enforcement, and the cultural desire for resolution all exerted pressure. His personal networks, once sources of strength, contained vulnerabilities. His reputation, simultaneously shield and target, amplified attention. The inevitability of his demise was not predestined by moral judgment alone, but by the intersection of social, technological, and psychological realities. Ultimately, the story of Jesse James is a study in contrasts: bravery and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, myth and mortality. He lived in a world of constant motion, skillfully navigating threats for decades, yet he was undone not by an enemy he could confront openly, but by an ally whose motives he misjudged. His life and death encapsulate the complexities of human behavior, the impact of historical forces on individual agency, and the enduring power of narrative to shape perception. In the end, Jesse James remains emblematic of the tension between action and consequence, legend and reality. His story illustrates how extraordinary skill and daring can elevate a man to mythic status, yet how the interplay of trust, circumstance, and human ambition can bring even the most formidable figure to a sudden and violent end. The outlaw who once eluded capture through audacity and cunning was ultimately overcome by the very social and human forces that shaped his existence, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate, provoke, and instruct generations long after the final gunshot rang out. The death of Jesse James did not mark the end of his story. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a new façon in which the legend of the man became larger than the man himself, his life and exploits transformed into myth, folklore, and cultural symbol. In the years following his death in 1882, newspapers, songs, dime novels, and local storytelling kept his memory alive, sometimes exaggerating his daring, romanticizing his violence, and portraying him in ways that reflected both admiration and fear. The narrative of Jesse James was shaped not only by historical facts but also by collective imagination. People remembered the outlaw not simply as a criminal, but as a figure who defied authority, lived on his own terms, and challenged a changing society that he had grown to resent. This transformation from man to myth illustrates the intricate interplay between real events, public perception, and cultural memory. After his assassination by Robert Ford, the immediate reaction among the public was complex. Some viewed the act as just and necessary, a restoration of law and order after decades of violent robberies. Others condemned it as a cowardly betrayal, a murder committed from behind rather than in the open, violating even the rough moral codes of the outlaw world. In Missouri and surrounding regions where Jesse had spent much of his career, stories of his life were retold with a mixture of awe, horror, and pride. People who had once assisted him quietly in his escapes or provided food and shelter now whispered tales of his exploits, emphasizing his daring and cleverness. These stories, passed along verbally, began to shape a folk memory in which Jesse James was elevated above ordinary criminals, his personality larger than life, his adventures imbued with a sense of moral drama, sometimes portraying him as a hero of the common man striking against impersonal banks, corporations, or post-war authorities. Newspapers of the time contributed significantly to this transformation. Editors like John Newman Edwards, who had previously defended Jesse and framed his actions as continuations of Confederate resistance, continued to write in ways that reinforced the image of Jesse James as a symbol of defiance. Even after his death, these narratives persisted, emphasizing his bravery, intelligence, and audacity, while minimizing the human cost of his crimes. Stories of his robberies, escapes, and confrontations with law enforcement were retold with embellishments. Entire episodes of gunfights and chases were dramatized, escape routes exaggerated, and feats of skill amplified. In some accounts, Jesse was no longer a man at risk of betrayal or injury, but an almost supernatural figure, whose cleverness and boldness allowed him to operate outside ordinary human constraints. The mythic Jesse James became a cautionary and fascinating figure at once, a warning against lawlessness, yet a romanticized figure for those fascinated by rebellion and freedom on the frontier. Dime novels played an especially important role in cementing this image. Cheap, widely circulated, and eagerly consumed, these publications often presented Jesse James as the quintessential American outlaw, a combination of cunning strategist, sharpshooter, and avenger of perceived injustices. Dime novelists transformed historical events into compelling narratives, blending truth and fiction seamlessly. Robberies were described as meticulously planned exploits, confrontations with lawmen as battles of wit and courage, and the man himself as a principled rebel rather than a criminal motivated solely by greed. While these accounts often took liberties with the facts, adding dramatic dialogue, invented companions, or fictitious scenarios, they reached a national audience and contributed to the enduring mystique of Jesse James. The figure that emerged in these pages was less a man who had lived a specific life and more a symbol of rebellion, risk, and the allure of freedom beyond the constraints of society. In addition to literature, songs and ballads celebrated Jesse James and immortalized his deeds in musical memory. Folk songs, passed down orally, recounted robberies, escapes, and narrow survivals, often portraying Jesse as a hero who challenged authority and outwitted his pursuers. The music further spread his legend beyond the immediate geography of Missouri and the surrounding states. The story of a man who defied the law for nearly 2 decades resonated deeply with people living through economic hardship, social upheaval, and the rapid modernization of the post-Civil War United States. Jesse James became a lens through which ordinary citizens could interpret and, to some extent, romanticize resistance to institutions that seemed impersonal, oppressive, or unaccountable. Cultural memory also began to divide along lines of region and ideology. In southern-leaning areas, Jesse James was often depicted as a heroic figure, a man resisting northern authority and continuing the fight for southern ideals. In other regions, he was remembered primarily as a dangerous criminal whose death was both justified and necessary. This dichotomy reinforced the complex nature of his legacy. He was simultaneously villain and hero, outlaw and symbol, depending on who was telling the story. The public's perception was not static. It evolved over decades, influenced by local sentiment, media portrayals, and the ongoing tension between nostalgia for the frontier and the emerging realities of law and order in a rapidly modernizing country. Historians who later studied Jesse James had to grapple with separating the man from the myth. The factual record bank robberies, train heists, interactions with gang members, and confrontations with law enforcement reveals a figure of extraordinary skill, audacity, and ruthlessness. He was capable of meticulous planning, understanding terrain and escape routes, and maintaining a loyal network of associates, yet he also engaged in violence that claimed lives, instilled terror, and disrupted communities. The legend that followed, however, often glossed over these darker realities, portraying him in heroic terms or framing his criminal actions as morally justified rebellion. Understanding Jesse James thus requires navigating the complex interplay between historical evidence, public memory, and cultural storytelling, recognizing both his skill and cunning as well as the human cost of his criminal career. The evolution of Jesse James' legacy continued into the 20th century as cinema, television, and modern literature drew upon his life. Early films often depicted him in the mold established by dime novels and folk songs, daring, almost superhuman, morally complex yet fundamentally admirable. The Western genre in particular found in Jesse James a template for the charismatic outlaw who challenges authority, navigates moral ambiguity, and survives through wit and skill. Actors portraying him emphasized his confidence, daring, and enigmatic personality, creating an enduring visual and narrative archetype that has persisted across generations. These portrayals reinforce the romanticized aspects of his persona, often downplaying the violence and human suffering associated with his actions in favor of emphasizing cunning, bravery, and rebellion. Academic study of Jesse James has likewise contributed to the refinement of his legacy. Scholars analyze the social, economic, and political context of his life, exploring the ways in which post-Civil War Reconstruction, regional tensions, and industrial expansion shaped both his choices and the public's perception of him. The man who had emerged from the guerrilla warfare of Missouri was in many ways a product of his environment, skilled in violence, adept at evasion, and attuned to the symbolic power of public perception. Yet scholarship also interrogates the myth-making process, examining how media, popular culture, and storytelling transformed his life into a legend that often obscures the factual complexity of his actions. This duality, historical figure and cultural symbol, remains central to understanding Jesse James' enduring place in American history. The fascination with Jesse James extends beyond historical or literary study. It reflects broader cultural questions about rebellion, law, morality, and fame.